3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history podcast from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. And this is our Some Sunday Context episode. On Sundays, during a very history-making first year of the second Trump administration, we are trying to do some episodes to give you a little historical context. Sometimes that's finding relevant shows from the archives, and sometimes that's getting together like we are now to chat about the latest events and to try and get some grounding. So today we thought we would look at the long and rocky history of the relationship between government and educational institutions. As it happens, there has always been this kind of carrot and stick of federal funding that has let governments intervene with what's going on campuses, though probably nothing like we have seen right at this moment. But some context always helps, and here to chat and provide that context are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
You two have thoughts about what's going on campuses?
Just a little.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like this has been all consuming for the past month or so, because obviously it touches every part of our work lives and our students' lives, and we gather at conferences and it's all we can talk about.
Sure.
Yeah.
And, we'll talk about some of the institutions that have been targeted, and then we'll talk about some of the sort of larger just chill, I think, that has gone over a lot of academia, and again, try and put it in a little bit of context. But first off, before we get going, let me just give a shout out to everyone who's watching this on YouTube. We are posting full video of this. So hello, YouTube. Go ahead and check it out there. Go ahead and subscribe. We're trying to do lots more video these days. And also shout out to everyone who kind of chipped in on Substack. For the first time this week, we did a little Substack chat for subscribers, and that's free to subscribe, by the way. But we did a little Substack chat where we asked for thoughts about this upcoming topic, and we're going to try and do more of that. So go ahead and subscribe to the newsletter at thisdaypod.com. Before we get to the history of the relationship between government and educational institutions, let's talk about this week. Lots went down. I mean, you can say that every single week. But any thoughts, and in particularly any kind of history-minded thoughts? Obviously, we saw the tariffs this week. It was just a week ago that we saw those massive protests all around the country.
Yeah.
There's also, and we almost did this today, but this also felt like a week in which there were a lot of stories about the administration targeting the work of history itself, right? We saw reports of how, at the library at the Navy, they've removed a lot of books about
300 books.
They kept Mein Kampf, interestingly enough. But, there's been funding battles and funding threats at the Smithsonian. It really feels like, and this will be an ongoing thing for us, especially heading into next year, the 250th, but kind of like, the project of history seems to be contested ground too. So, at some point we'll talk about that. But anyway, those are lots going on this week. But Kellie, where do you want to start?
Oh my God. I don't even know. I mean, so in Boston, speaking of protests, so in Boston, we had a huge turnout. I mean, 100,000 people were packed into Boston Common and around the state capitol. It was massive. I did not go. I was out of town. I was traveling, but I saw the footage and it was just kind of incredible to see that many people coming out to protest, coming out to speak out, bringing their kids. It was very much a family affair. And it was also a very white affair. I mean, I know people joke about Boston being very white all the time, but we do have large ethnic communities. And I was actually kind of heartened by that. I think maybe it's because, I don't know, this feels like a very white supremacist moment. And so seeing white people actually doing the work, stepping up to the plate, saying like, no, this is not okay, felt very encouraging. But I'm concerned. For a long time, I was the historian in residence for the Museum of African American History in Boston. They've lost about $500,000 of their funding. They're worried about keeping their doors open. And they've been around for over 100 years. So some of these institutions that are so a part of the fabric of our lives in the communities that we live in, especially in Boston, feels like everything's just at risk.
There are those real tensions between, on the one hand, you're seeing people organize and trying to figure out ways to protect their students, protect immigrants, fight for these institutions, make their voices heard. And there's something very heartening about that. On the other hand, you're seeing the dismantling of all of these institutions, and I think this goes to what you were saying, Kellie. There's this; it's just a small one, but I think it's emblematic of all of this. The Wilson Center in Washington D.C., which I've worked with over the past several years as one of their board members, and it's a Congress-created institution. The executive should not be able to touch it, and yet they've shut it down. And so just seeing the ripple effect of that one institution in the lives of the people around me, people who were planning to go on leave because they had fellowships. Now they don't get their full salary. People who had full-time jobs there and now have lost their jobs. Graduate students who are reliant on their fellowships and their training. It's just gone now. And we've talked about this before, but like, it's so easy to destroy things and it takes so long to rebuild them.
So true.
So I feel like the weight of all of that destruction right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've been having a lot of those similar conversations. That I do, I remain convinced that at some point, maybe not in too far the distant future, there will be a moment where someone comes in and says, let's flip on a lot of these switches again. But I think it's a lot harder to flip that switch back on and get the machine going than it is to just, flip it off, which I think is part of the project on the part of Doge and the Trump administration. And, we'll talk about that through the educational lens for sure, a kind of like nexus of educational institutions and government that was built up over the course of decades, if not a century, and now flip it off. It's not going to come back immediately. But
and these are a lot of fragile institutions too. These aren't institutions that were sort of like robust in their pockets to start with, and so it makes it all the more precarious.
Niki, any year you're thinking of, or any issue from this week that you want to touch on before we get into schools and funding?
Yeah, the year I'm thinking of is in the not too distant history is 2001. I've been thinking about it a lot, in part because I think we're still living in the long tail of the events of 2001. Like, I don't think we'd be here right now if it hadn't been for the U.S. response to the terror attacks of that year. But more immediately, I remember I was living in a very small town in the middle of cornfields in northeastern Indiana when the September 11th attack happened. And there was like a fear and a panic that seized everyone. People were like, oh, you've got to go get gas because gas is going to be $8 a gallon. And we have to lock down all of the buildings because what if somebody comes and attacks our Muslim students? And you're just like gripped with this sense that like the world is falling apart and you have to act immediately. And it's rumors and different things that people are acting on. And, obviously none of that eventuated. It was just like an expression of everyone's fear and anxiety. But actually, if you like take a step back, like much worse things happened in the years that followed, whether we're talking about the wars or we're talking about the stripping of civil liberties, we think about torture, we think about all of these different things that happened in the years after. Right now, I think we're still in that panic moment where we're just like, they're renditioning people. They're taking people off the streets. They're losing their jobs. They're going to close down the university. Like, there's that kind of fluster. But it makes me think about like 10 years from now when we look back and think of the long tail of what's happening in this moment. I've been thinking about that a lot. I've also been thinking, just speaking of renditioning, the U.S. government keeps taking people off the streets, and they were going to take them to Guantanamo. Now they're renditioning them to El Salvador and refusing to bring them back so far. They're doing that in part because of the aftermath of 9/11 and the renditioning of people to Guantanamo. The Supreme Court said, well, actually, the Constitution reaches into Guantanamo. Those people have, at the very least, habeas corpus rights. Like the minimal right you can have, but habeas corpus rights. And there's a reason they're sending them to El Salvador, not Guantanamo Bay. They want to get out of the reach of the Constitution. And I think we, too, have to understand their actions as part of the aftermath of trying to protect civil liberties after 9/11.
I mean, we've spent the last 7 minutes talking about chaos and uncertainty and panic, and we haven't even mentioned the tariffs,
the tariffs.
Obviously that was all the things we just reflected were playing out this week in that as well. And, obviously the difference, though, between the kind of uncertainty and panic, say, in the wake of 9/11 and obviously in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, was a lot of this was just purely self-inflicted. Our president decided to kind of do this to ourselves. But, that relates a little bit to something I've been thinking about. And, maybe if you'll allow me a little bit, and a fair, maybe largely inconsequential, I told you so moment. But,
we welcome it.
Okay.
Sure.
But look, I don't know if you remember when we did an episode somewhere around inauguration, and I kind of floated the idea that I was thinking about at that moment, where I said, I wonder if that window between election and inauguration will end up being the kind of high watermark for the cultural cachet of MAGA. And strictly in that sense, in terms of the culture, and Niki, maybe you'll disagree because you watch these spaces, but I do feel like the vibes have shifted a little bit culturally. And again, maybe this is projecting, but like Elon Musk is not cool anymore. I think that's pretty clear. I don't know, this week, like Sam Harris called out Joe Rogan. A guest went on Joe Rogan and called him out for being irresponsible. Like I'm just picking up these little signs. And then even related to the tariffs, the Trump voters I know are mostly come from that kind of like heterodox anti-left circles, people who kind of hate the left, hate what they think of as illiberalism, think of themselves as edgy thinkers, and they kind of found their way to supporting Trump. And a lot of them did that, I think, because they felt like, well, at least my portfolio looked good and Trump won and, so forth. Those people are horrified right now by the tariffs thing, and it's a bummer that it took to horrify them. But like a lot of those folks are like, oh, my God, what have we done? And then I got to say,
nothing like a tariff to show you where your allegiances lie. Nothing like a tariff.
On the like vibes and culture side, I also got to say something. I've been thinking about this, but like, to me, at least, Mark Zuckerberg looks like the biggest doofus in the world right now. Like, I just
biggest
think
doofus.
he did the like most classic buy high I've ever seen in terms of wearing that chain and going on Rogan and talking about masculine energy. I think like right at the last possible moment to get on that train and right before I think, the rubber met the road and like we've seen what, how it's shifted. So I don't know. Maybe again, this is projecting, and again, it's just purely in a cultural sense, like all the like actual fallout from this. But I do think that matters, and I don't know, I don't know what you guys think, but I kind of feel like the cool is gone a little bit.
Yeah.
There are definitely more tensions in that heterodox space.
Yeah.
And there are tensions in like the straight uncut MAGA space because there's been a lot of like the sort of mediators of MAGA, like the media people, podcasters, and things like that, who are like, hey, what are we going to do? Because they realize that it's like bad policy. It's going to hurt a lot of people. And so actually what's really interesting is like they're really pushing the short-term pain for long-term gain line.
Yeah.
And also they're not asking their audiences how they feel about the tariffs.
Nope.
They're asking them, do you trust Donald Trump?
Right.
And I feel like that's a big tell.
Wow.
Yeah. And again, that might be a strong enough sort of allegiance that it'll sort of paper over all this stuff.
No, I mean, it's always, we talk about this a lot, that I told you so moment where people always feel like they are exempt from these policies, that they can somehow opt out of like the sort of disappointment or job loss or loss in their stock and things of that nature. And then when you start to people go on social media talking about, wait a second, I didn't think he meant my job, or wait a second, this is my 401k. Like, people start to have these come to Jesus moments a little bit, and we'll see how long that lasts. Because I think even that is sort of like, if there is any little movement back towards them, then they dig right back in again. And
no,
so
I think we're going to ride the roller coaster of like cool, uncool, up and down and up and down. And honestly, I think this was a little bit the story of last election. It might be the story of the midterms. It might be the story of the next election. It's just like, what slope of that roller coaster do you happen to be on like the week before election day, And I think the like Trump is cool, MAGA's cool, let's roll the dice and be edgy was like on the upswing in the 2 weeks before last election, and that made a difference. And who knows, but yeah. All right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and do kind of context framing, some, I think, really fascinating and useful look at the relationship, as I said, between government, educational institutions, carrots, sticks, meddling, hands off, so forth. And it has kind of been a lot rockier over the years than I think maybe I realized. But, obviously the context here, the current context is that the Trump administration is coming for a lot of educational institutions, particularly these so-called elite research institutions. The government has yanked or threatened to yank more than $12 billion in funding. A lot of that money is actually tied to Harvard and its affiliates and like its hospitals. But, 400 million at Columbia, hundreds of millions at GW, Harvard, some of the other schools, Johns Hopkins, NYU, Northwestern, Berkeley has gotten some threats. And then, the University of Minnesota, University of Southern California, we can get a sense of the kinds of institutions that they're coming after. I want to talk at the end of this about why you think this is happening and what you think the fallout will be. But kind of any initial quick thoughts that launch us into looking at this history, or do you want to just kind of dive into it?
I say we dive in. I mean, I do have thoughts, but I don't want to take us.
Yeah.
I don't want to take us too deep
we'll
down.
spend the whole 40 minutes talking about our current thoughts if we don't
We
start
will.
with the history.
Right. Well, I think that the history helps us really understand what's going on right now. So let me very quickly run through 1600s, 1700s, basically up until the Civil War. But obviously, I think people know a lot of the early institutions in this country were founded primarily by religious groups, private benefactors. There was a little bit of some state charter, but when you look at Harvard in 1636 and Yale in 1701 and Columbia in 1754, those are generally founded as religious institutions. And it starts to build that kind of ivory tower idea, which I don't know. Do you guys have thoughts on that phrase, ivory tower? I wanted to look up where it came from. I don't know exactly, but I think for better and worse, this idea that universities are removed, they're elite institutions. They kind of, who knows what happens up in that ivory tower, but that's their role.
I think it's what scholars in recent years have been pushing so hard against is that idea that universities are somehow removed from society. Some folks at universities have never had the privilege of being removed from society. Like they've always been translators of the world and activists within the institution. But there are also like plenty of people who are cloistered in the university, and that's the benefit of it to them, right? That they can sort of be out of the stream of the world.
Yeah.
If you think about the fact that education, particularly higher education, has always been an elite coveted space for money people, that regular people did not have access to higher education in that kind of way. We've always upheld it in sort of the same sort of sacred space that we do like religion and church and things of that nature. And I think as you get, further into the 19th century and even into the 20th century, you get a much more sort of democratic effect on education where more and more people have access to it. And I think that changes the tone and tenor.
Well, that central question, what is this for? What kind of people are we training? Runs through all of this and is obviously related to both the scrutiny the universities get and the kind of funding that they get and support that they get, but yeah, that is central. And I think one of the key moments at which that question starts to change, or that idea of like, what are universities for, is, in the 1860s, you have the rise of the land grant institution. So there's the Morrill Act of 1862, Morrill, not Moral. The Morrill Act of 1862, which is this kind of landmark moment where the federal government, and especially the states, give land to fund universities. And those universities are mostly focused on agriculture, science, engineering. This is where you get the rise of so many of these public universities. HBCUs start to get in on this game a little bit too. We've talked about that. But, it starts to create this direct funding partnership between universities and governments. Two things to point out. One is a lot of it is at the state level. And I think that like the land grant era can be seen as a place where like particular states have particular needs, and they basically have said like, hey, we need a citizenry who is trained in agriculture or engineering or whatever for our local needs, right? And that really kind of affected the tenor of what kinds of institutions were built and what kind of funding they got and what kind of demands there were on them. It's this larger idea that we're trying to build a citizenry that will help this larger project. And it's not just about elite education or liberal arts for its own sake, but really about like a civic project of building up this country for particular needs, often at the local level.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about HBCUs, like that was the whole sort of basis of their foundation was, a lot of HBCUs started to educate preachers and teachers. And then later, you had agricultural science, but like the number one thing enslaved people wanted was literacy. And so you needed teachers. You needed to educate teachers as fast as you could that were credentialed, that could go into these schools and do that work. And so you start to see that like very immediately after the Civil War, really a big part of Reconstruction is public education.
Yeah.
I think it's also important that in that period, like the federal government's role is giving the land to the land grant universities.
Yeah.
And then they are mostly out of it after that. So these are state institutions. And even then, like the universities are really kind of running themselves.
Yeah.
But that idea of like, we're here to make a particular kind of individual, is really interesting, because then I think that shifts as we get into the 20th century to a little bit more, well, universities have a larger project to advance research and science and be a sort of partner to the government in that way. And that really starts to kick in, in the 30s and then especially into the 40s related to World War II. So, Kellie, I think this is where we bring in a key character in this whole story, but a man by the name of Vannevar. What a name. Vannevar. Vannevar Bush, who's kind of the first one to say, like, hey, maybe universities should be about something else.
Yeah. Vannevar Bush, he is the vice president and dean of engineering at MIT. And he comes out with this report in Science, the Endless Frontier in 1945, and basically says that colleges and universities need to be laying the groundwork for this partnership between federal research funding and scientific research and development, your original sort of R&D, if you will. And if you think about it, I mean, especially in a post-World War II moment, universities, especially, and I think we did an episode on this with Harvard and sort of the testing of napalm. And when you think about how places like MIT and Harvard and Columbia are partnering with the NIH and all of these other federal organizations to do that research, to test for bombs, to test for new military missiles and things of that nature. Like all of these universities get in bed with the federal government in a way to help advance the military industrial complex, to help, but not just for warfare, also like scientific research, cancer research, things of that nature.
That bed is lined with dollar bills, right?
Yeah. Yes. Defense dollars are making that bed nice and cushy.
I was trying to say they're doing other good things, but yeah, that really, the 1940s is a huge moment, especially because if you think of the GI Bill, I mean, that bill was instrumental in bringing more men and women into colleges and universities in ways that they had never had that kind of attendance. I mean, colleges are doubling their student enrollment. They're having to build all kinds of new buildings because of the wave of, or the influx of students coming to college for the first time, because now they can afford to pay for it.
Yeah.
Right. You have the GI Bill bringing all of these new students onto campus, and we'll talk in a minute about some of the knock-on effects of that. But I think it's worth staying with what's happening to universities in the early Cold War. Yes, they are getting tons of funding. Kellie mentioned napalm at Harvard. The Manhattan Project gets its start at Columbia.
We did an episode about this. They tested napalm on the Harvard football field. It was one of my favorite episodes.
Yes.
But that was the first time they tested napalm, was on the football field. There's an incredible photo. I think it's 45. Of basically a bomb exploding on the field on like a Saturday morning.
Well, the Manhattan Project is called the Manhattan Project because they started the exploration of making atomic weapons at Columbia's campus. Yeah. And then they were like, should we do this in the middle of Manhattan? Or should we go find a desert somewhere to do this? And so it moves out to New Mexico. But so these universities are instrumental in setting the conditions of the Cold War in terms of military and technology. But also they are sites of deep contention and investigation during this period. The Cold War comes directly to these universities in the form of the Red Scare, where suddenly people are forced to take loyalty oaths. They are dragged before Congress and asked whether they're communists. If people think they might be communists, they could be fired, lose their jobs, be blackballed from education. And part of the reason is not just that these are professors who are inculcating children with their ideas or young adults with their ideas. But because the university is part of the military-industrial complex, you have to get security clearances from the federal government to work on these things. And so people are getting fired. And as we've talked about before, they're also getting fired if they were gay. All of these different things were seen as sort of weak points in universities. And universities play ball. Like they're all in. as we
sure
think about what universities are doing today.
I want to return to the Red Scare pressures, especially. And, there's some really fascinating stories in there that really echo now. But like, it feels to me like World War II and then the post World War II era. It kind of feels like everything. The relationship just sort of is across the broad spectrum. So you have the GI Bill, which I think falls into that category we were talking earlier about. We need to support individuals who are then going to help our country. But then there's also this sort of research institution explosion, mostly at the graduate level. It's not about individuals. It's about science, technology, things that will help the military effort. So it's just important to kind of point out how all the threads seem to be coming together in this moment. And I get what you're saying, Niki, and we will talk about some of the like communist witch hunts. But there is also, I think, a little bit of a sense of there aren't that many strings attached. So there's at least a fundamental fealty towards this idea that we're going to give money to universities and they're going to do their thing. And maybe, in return, we get an atomic bomb, great, but then we're not going to like get up in their business about the other stuff they're doing. And I think Vannevar Bush, who wrote this sort of seminal paper in 1945, explicitly said that, he explicitly said like the way for these institutions to work is to get funding and to be able to operate on their own. So I don't know.
Like separation of church and state.
Yeah,
like
what's your strings attached?
Give us the money and get out the way.
So like on the strings attached scale, where do you kind of come down in this like the 40s and 50s into the
the strings aren't very onerous. I mean, again, like on the Cold War front, like the universities were playing ball. They weren't necessarily being forced that much. But also everyone, like the politicians, people in government, people in federal research institutions, people at universities, they all shared the same basic values, right? They had the same understanding of science and research and discovery. Universities were like the crown jewel of the U.S. institutional system. And so there was this sense that like, let them do their thing. They're doing great. We just need to get them more money so they can do more great things. I feel like that was the big idea, certainly starting by the late 50s and 60s, was get them the cash and they will do great things.
Yeah. And this raises the cachet of all of these universities and institutions. I mean, they become premier competitive institutions to study for grad school, to get postdocs or fellowships to. I mean, this is when I really think you start to see the prestige that comes out of a lot of these universities from what they can produce from their research.
And it's hard to overstate, we have talked about it on the show, but how much money is floating around and sloshing around. And a lot of times you hear stories of people who kind of don't even realize that their funding is tied back to the military and they're just kind of doing their thing. They think they're at a university. And yes, I think it's a lot of the values are shared, and it's a lot of like, as long as you get us you advance the project that the government is interested in, then you can go do your own thing, which sometimes might include, hey, Ken Kesey, like go ahead and try some of that acid that you guys are experimenting on. Psychedelics come out of this as well, and
the internet comes out of this.
The internet, obviously, the internet comes out of this. Do your thing, and as long as every once in a while you kind of build us a new weapon or something, we're good.
Can we reach back for one more thread before
please.
We move out of this period? So the GI Bill. Right, opens up the university for mostly like white men, but in the process, it is opening up the university. And so by the time you get to the 1960s, universities writ large, higher education in the United States is not just an elite phenomenon. Like it is now seen as part of middle class advancement.
Yep.
So you have all of these students who are coming from all of these different backgrounds and who are beginning to question the structure of all of these U.S. institutions. And universities are particularly hierarchical at a moment when youth culture is particularly anti-hierarchical. And so because of this relationship between the universities and the military and the government, the Vietnam War in particular becomes a flashpoint. There had been earlier flashpoints. The Black Civil Rights Movement had led to a lot of conflict with universities that were trying to either keep segregation in place or shut down protest. But the Vietnam War really brings together all of these threads and really puts a spotlight on the role that the universities are playing in the war. And students begin to resist not just the war and the military and the government, but they look at the universities too, and they're like, we need to blow this up.
Yeah, you're complicit. Yeah. And I don't want to go attend a university where they're conducting this kind of research. I don't want to be here when they're making napalm.
Yeah.
Or I want more of a voice in the decisions the university is making.
So how does the federal government then respond to that? I mean, do they try and use their funding as a cudgel to tamp that down?
Well,
I don't think so. I think what they do is they just bring in the cops. They shut it down. Like, it
and the
becomes,
spooks.
yes, but it becomes I mean, in the 60s and 70s, some campuses became police states. I mean, when you look at Kent State and you think about a student who is literally shot and killed by the National Guard, like, they literally send in their pit bulls to enforce business as usual, to enforce the status quo. And that does shut down a lot of those protests.
Yeah. No. Kent State is May of 1970. I want to highlight in September of 1970, J. Edgar Hoover sends an open letter to U.S. college students, which gets printed in newspapers all around the country, basically advising them to reject leftist politics. And some of this language, well, it's funny. I went and reread the whole letter, and part of it is like, oh, wow, this is a letter intended to chill a bunch of people and threaten a bunch of people. But I also read it and was like, well, even Hoover, compared to some of the language that we see now, was at least kind of paying lip service to the idea that, like, the campuses should be, bastions of free speech and people should have a bunch of ideas and be able to exchange ideas and express themselves. He at least pays a little lip service to that. But in this letter, which we'll post in the show notes and on social, he basically says, like, hey, 20-year-olds of America, quote, the extremists are a small minority of students and faculty members who have lost faith in America. They ridicule the flag, poke fun at American institutions, seek to destroy our society. They are not interested in genuine reform. They take advantage of the tension, strife, and often legitimate frustrations of students to promote campus chaos. They have no rational, intelligent plan of the future, either for the university or the nation. So, Hoover sends this letter when you see a letter from the FBI director, like, I think the message gets sent, though in there is not and we're going to withhold $400 million in funding.
Yeah.
Well, he saw the problem as most sort of concerned adults did, as the problem is these like out of control students, and probably that the universities aren't cracking down on them hard enough, but the universities themselves aren't the problem, right?
Yes.
We like the universities. We just need to get rid of the troublemakers.
Yeah.
So
dang gum humanities.
Before we get into the 70s and the 80s and 90s and then to now, I do want to return very briefly to, we mentioned the kind of Red Scare and how universities got caught up in the Red Scare. And no surprise, but this, in the early 50s feels like something actually quite relevant and evocative to today.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the Red Scare, the second Red Scare in the 1950s, in part because of the role that universities played in it. So the University of California in 1950 required its faculty to sign a political loyalty oath. So first they had to declare that they weren't communists and they didn't believe in communism. And then the other was loyalty to California and to the United States, which basically said, like, we're loyal to the Constitution. We don't espouse radical beliefs. And you could already see some of the problems with this. Like, it's policing your beliefs, and it's also forcing you to sign an oath. And there's a real resistance from the faculty. They don't want to sign. 900 of them refuse to sign unanimously. And those who refused to sign the loyalty oath were terminated. They were just summarily fired. And ultimately, there's a court case about this. The courts get involved. They're like, you cannot force your faculty to sign a loyalty oath that says they don't hold radical beliefs, that they don't think radical thoughts. And so the courts strike it down, and a lot of the people were reinstated. But the pressure continues on these students and these faculty in the years ahead.
Yeah.
I mean, that feels so resonant to now, especially the kind of courts intervening. And then it's like, well, sure, but maybe some of the damage is already done.
Yeah.
And, this continues over the next year or two. Joseph McCarthy puts a lot of pressure on university administrators. And we see in the same way we're seeing now, we see some administrators kind of roll over and some push back. And then I couldn't figure out exactly why Sarah Lawrence College was a target here, but 18 faculty members at Sarah Lawrence are like basically dragged before McCarthy's Senate committee and end up being pressured to resign. But yeah, we see that kind of like individual vendetta targeting thing kind of playing out in the early 50s as well.
I would not be shocked at all if in the next year there's some version of a loyalty oath at some of these universities as a condition of federal funding.
Yeah, that would not That would not surprise me at all either. All right. Let's go now from the sort of pressure. There's, let's call that the golden years, as rocky as they are, the 50s and 60s with funding, and then into the 70s, the campus protests. The 80s and 90s are another big shift. And I saw someone post something the other day that was basically like, it's incredible how consistently, whenever you look at a chart of anything in U.S. history, the like big deviation point is the Reagan era, and it's just like, wealth inequality and trade and basically anything you pick. It's like Reagan just changed everything. And I think we see, whether it was the Reagan administration itself or the kind of larger picture of what happened to our economy in the 80s, but we really see in the 80s and into the 90s a rise of basically a marketization of universities and kind of this idea that universities are another player in the same sort of game that any other kind of for-profit institution has to play, and sort of this idea of market-based accountability intervening with how we should view and assess universities, and in turn how we should fund them. There's a lot of things going on there. One is just I think this larger idea that I think the Reagan era introduced and persisted today, that basically everything should be measured on a kind of how profitable are you standard against the sort of capitalistic framework. But that also affects a little bit of this shift of how universities get funding. And this, in the 80s and 90s, is really the rise of federal funding going a little less towards research and big grants to universities. And a lot of it is shifting to students themselves. And we see the rise of student aid and loans. And I think there's a little bit of a shift back from thinking of education as a public good, which is like, let's build a good citizenry, let's fund these at the higher level, to a private good, which is how do we get individuals to increase their market value in their 4 years in an institution. And a lot of that then manifests itself by targeting them with loans and student aid, which again is important, but it's an interesting shift. Any thoughts there?
It's a hugely important shift. I mean, this is the neoliberal university. This is the idea that students are consumers. They are buying a product from you. You have to make those consumers happy. You have to give them a good return on their investment. And the university's achievement of its goals is in customer satisfaction, U.S. news ratings, and the size of their endowments.
That's
it's all market based.
And then you throw in sports, and everything is sort of blown off the top. Like, I can't tell you how much colleges and universities have changed by the explosion of money in sports and the idea of students being customers. The idea that like, well, I'm paying for this and this is very expensive, and so I need to have a return on my investment. And I mean, gosh, you get into the 2000s and college is really becoming unaffordable. Like, when you think about college in the 40s and 50s and even in the 60s, like, it was expensive, but you could be working class, you could be middle class, and you could afford to go to college. You could work a job and you could pay for your tuition throughout the year. And that also helps create a more robust middle class, the idea that people can afford to pay for college. But when you start getting these tuitions that become, 5 figures and then later 6 figures, that is not something that's widely accessible to everyone.
And college becomes a barrier to entering the middle class in some ways when you're saddled with $100,000 in student loan debt that's not dischargeable. I mean, this is that you can't sell college as in the public interest or as a public good when you are privatizing the cost of it. Right? Yeah. Like, they're federally subsidized loans, but that just means that you're in hock to the federal government for some people for much of the rest of their lives. And that, I think, absolutely changes the equation. I don't think it's a chicken and egg situation. I think it's the sort of market-based university comes first. And then, I'm going to purchase this thing because at the end, I'm going to get something really good out of it. And that equation actually kind of has fallen apart in the last 15 to 20 years.
And that market-based approach also starts to affect a little bit what we're discussing here, which is kind of where does the funding come from? How does the federal government and state governments think of their investment in universities? And it gets tied up in all these same things we're talking about here. Graduation rates, job placements, U.S. news ratings, like all the metrics are incentivized and are tied to it. I don't think there's a ton of examples of kind of using that as an ideological weapon necessarily in the 80s and 90s as this marketization starts to come in, but it lays the groundwork absolutely for that. I just want to offer one stat that kind of really highlights how, as I see it, like what happens on campuses became kind of local business to now everyone's business, and it relates to funding. But okay, so in 1990, state funding per student was about 140% higher than federal funding. So just like the state local funding was way higher than federal funding. By 2015, and this was really accelerated in the aftermath of the Great Recession, but that difference was just 12%. And to me, you know, I know that's complicated. It's a funding issue, but to me, it just shows you the gap between that's your business and that's everyone's business. State funding, federal funding, just completely narrowed. And now, for some reason, what happens on campuses, everyone has an opinion. It seems to be everyone's business.
And it makes it so much more centralized, right? That what's happening at the University of Virginia matters to you if you live in Montana because it's federal funds. And I also think that reflects the tilt toward the sciences and toward engineering and computing and all of those things, that as state funding is falling, there are all of these federal agencies, NASA, National Cancer Institute, NIH, NSF, that are pouring funds into these schools. And so you're seeing the collapse of state funding, but the federal funding is there and shaping what's actually being studied in those universities.
And then we've talked about this on the show a few weeks ago. I think we did an episode on the kind of the history of the DEI wars, but a lot of those were campus based. And certainly in the 90s, you have the kind of PC wars as they were on campuses. And just to kind of frame that again, I think that's where you get a lot of the kind of larger cultural freak out about what's happening on campuses, especially, you know, so-called elite liberal institutions. That is the center of what's happening now. But I also think the 90s and the PC wars there were kind of the last moment where like those felt like just campus drama, you know? I mean, I remember showing up at, you know, I've said this before, right? I remember showing up at my university in the 2000s and kind of having this like echo of the PC wars in the 90s and mostly thinking of it as, man, there was a lot of drama on campus, but not like, oh man, the whole world was watching and gave a shit about what was happening at this like liberal arts institution. But I think that set the stage for this larger dynamic that is now, you know, manifesting itself of people really seem to care what's happening on campuses. There's this whole tricky, messy federal funding relationship, and now they're kind of being pit against each other.
I think you can't understand it without noting the role of right-wing media and the conservative movement in turning this into a thing. I won't go over the whole timeline, but everything from like William F. Buckley's God and Man at Yale in 1951, which is an attack on Yale University and its liberal orthodoxies, John Laboutier's Harvard Hates America in 1980. But then like Pat Buchanan is trying to make it a thing in his 1992 campaign. Reagan is making it a thing as governor and then as president. And it's not breaking through. It's not breaking through, although it's starting to erode the conservative thought on universities, and that then enters the mainstream. And I think where we are now is the dividends of that multi-generational attack on universities.
Can I say, and maybe this is another I told you so moment, but I feel like for the 90s, for the 2000s, all colleges and universities were pushing STEM hard, like hard. You want a job, you want to be successful, you got to do computer science, you got to do mathematics, you got to do chemistry, whatever it was not seen as valuable to major in English or history unless you wanted to go to law school. But all of these other sort of like more niche or more humanist majors were poo-pooed. And now we're in a moment where they are coming after the science. They are coming after the research. They are coming after all of these things. And scientists who thought that they had opted out, who thought they had chose well, are late to the movement. I'm like, oh, you're worried? You're worried about your viability? Like, you know, and it's not to say that I want them to be, but it's this idea that like, you can never, academics know, you can never really separate the humanities and STEM. They have to go hand in hand. They have to work together. And we've always sort of seen the humanities as expendable or frivolous or not necessary. And now we are seeing like how vital it is to have both of these ideas at the table, you know, and it's in a weird position. My nephew went to MIT. He's getting his PhD in Stanford in immunology. He graduates this fall. Or this May. I'm really excited.
Flex, Kellie.
Yeah, I know.
No
it's a flex.
kidding.
I know. But he's worried about jobs. You know, he's for the first time worried, like, wait, all of this federal funding was tethered to these startups, to these labs, to the cancer research that I wanted to do. And now I don't know if I can get a job in academia. I don't know if I can, you know, work in a lab or, you know, find employment in these areas. And that was never, ever a feeling that people in STEM had.
Yeah, I mean, STEM, as Kellie just said, felt like they were protected. There's a great Martin Niemöller poem about this exact dynamic. And this idea that like everyone is under attack now and the universities are being dismantled piece by piece, but not actually piece by piece. They're being dismantled wholesale at this point. And we don't know what this looks like because the 20th century US state was built on universities. The prosperity that the US has enjoyed for much of the last 150 years built on universities. The universities are the major employers in towns across this country. And most of our scientific innovation comes from these federally funded studies that are carried out through universities, not to mention our knowledge of the past and our knowledge of languages and our knowledge. And that's why they're under attack, actually. They're countervailing institutions that have a real economic and social and cultural power to counter the executive. And the executive is currently working very, very hard to attack, dismantle, and silence every possible critic in society.
So I think that's clearly part of the dynamic. But let me offer one other thought that, again, gets to this basic question of like, why? Why are they targeting universities in this way? And I do think it relates to this whole history that we've been laying out of research institutions and the role that institutions have played and the kind of dark side of that over the last 10, 15 years, which is I think that Silicon Valley has convinced itself that it is now the place for innovation, you know? And there's this idea that we don't need these universities to create new things, to build new bombs, to build new airplanes, to do research and innovation, you know, and obviously there was like that whole kind of thing in Silicon Valley, especially 10 years ago, where VCs were saying, look at all the founders of all the big companies. None of them went to college. What do you need college for? Skip it. So I think there's that kind of like, what is college for cultural thing? But I think there's basically a market assessment. They're like, we are competing with universities. We don't need universities to build stuff. That money should come to us, not to them. And I think that's definitely a big part of what's going on here.
Yeah. Really smart.
I think there's just this feeling that we don't need you anymore to kind of innovate and build new things. Though I do really want to point out, like, COVID was a recent example of universities having a big role. I mean, Project Warp Speed was your kind of like prototypical universities and companies and federal government working together with lots of funding to really innovate and solve a problem in that kind of classic post-war sense. Vannevar Bush would have been very proud. But even though it's in recent history, people are not looking at it and saying, oh, yeah, that's the role of institutions. That's why they should be funded. We still have arrived at this moment where they are being questioned and undermined and their funding is being targeted.
But colleges and universities are doing so much more than educating the next startup or the next cancer researcher. Like, you know, there's so much more that goes into that. There's so much more that is actually a degree is required to do a lot of jobs. Like, and I don't think we have had a deep appreciation of what that means or what that entails. We just think we're spending a lot of money. We're not getting a lot out of it. You're going $100,000 in debt to get a job that pays $50,000, you know, and people have a real disconnect about how college is meant to improve their own individual lives.
I will also just add that universities, and this is not true of every university, but certainly the elite universities, and I think not just the elite universities, broke their side of the bargain too. They became hedge funds that are interested in return on investment to shareholders more than they are in investing and rebuilding their communities. They have been voracious land grabbers who have damaged the communities around them. They have given into those very values that you're talking about, Jody, is absorbing the ideas of Silicon Valley and putting that into their education and pushing this kind of I don't know, dropping, I think, the idea that a well-rounded education is a good thing.
Yeah.
Listen,
And they've
when the football coach is paid more than the president are, when you've got, non-tenure track and tenure track faculty that can barely make ends meet, but all of like sort of your coaches and your administrators are also being paid topped out. There's a real imbalance there in terms of where your priorities are.
Yeah.
And it's made universities conservative institutions. That's the thing that like the faculty and the students get attacked as being like liberals and leftists, but universities themselves, and you saw this in the response to the student protests, like they're conservative institutions.
They're risk
and
averse.
they're risk averse.
Yeah. Which is interesting because if they're Silicon Valleying themselves, the whole ostensibly ethos of Silicon Valley is we're less scared of risk, right? We're more insulated.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the big question that I want to ask the two of you. And the big question that's popped up to me, which is, even Niki, if we take it that these institutions have kind of given into market forces and they've become rapacious and they've kind of thought only about the bottom line. Well, a lot of them have built up enormous endowments through that approach. And so my fundamental question is, now when the federal government tries to apply pressure and withhold funding, what's the point of that huge billions of dollars endowment if not to insulate you in moments like this? So, well, I guess that's my question.
Well, Princeton is using their endowment in order to protect itself, and other universities are choosing other things. Obviously,
Yale did too a little bit, but
yeah, and Columbia hasn't.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I think that, first we should say not all universities have billions and billions of dollars of endowments, but it's interesting that the highly targeted ones do. And some are using their endowments to protect themselves and some aren't.
Yeah.
I think it tells you a lot about the values of the place and how comfortable they are going along with the administration for their own ends.
So let's return to that list that I read at the beginning of universities that have been targeted. Columbia, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, NYU, Northwestern,
Princeton,
GW. Like what gives? What do you make of that list? Why has the target been on these kind of basically Ivies?
Well, they're private institutions, and I think that makes a big difference. When you're the University of Illinois or, even some California schools, like they have a little bit more control because they are a state institution and they can sort of maneuver differently. But I think these private institutions, are coming under attack because the government only has that sort of stick of its financial aid to hold over it. I mean, I think a lot of private institutions also thought that they were safe from the Trump administration. Like, oh, we're private, so they can do that over in Florida, but it doesn't matter here because, we're private. And that's just not the case.
Also, they're the only schools the oligarchs running the country have ever heard of.
Correct.
Like they don't know what a community college is.
Right.
And so it's a symbolic battle and a media battle as well as a financial one. Though we should say, like, Donald Trump cut off all federal funding to the universities in Maine in order to get revenge on their governor. So all of the universities are being affected. The ones that are being sort of most visibly targeted are the ones that have cultural and political cachet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny. I mean, for a while, often in Trump 1, through the Trump era, I've tried as a kind of journalist or thinker of these things, I've tried to resist the personal psychological lens to understand things, but I've dispensed with that. I really actually think that's probably the best lens. And I think on that front, you're right, Niki. Like a lot of this is just, these are the elite universities that we know of. These are the schools that we want to send our kids to. And I don't like what's happening on those campuses. And so we're going to target them. And then moreover, a real phenomenon, which is the sort of irony. The interesting thing is that a lot of these elite institutions have done serious work to democratize themselves, right? You look at some of the stats about the low-income kids who are going to some of these, the Harvards and the Yales and so forth. And so I think there's a real kind of personal sense of loss and grievance of like, oh my God, the Harvard that I knew is no longer for me.
Yeah.
And I think the Gaza protests sort of put that in sharp relief, but I think there's just been this slow boil of the last 10 years, 15 years for a lot of these people who are saying, oh my gosh, the ivory tower isn't just for me anymore.
That is the real, again, we need to be honest. This is not about anti-Semitism. This is about who is at these institutions. Why does MIT have 15% African Americans? There's a real push to segregate these colleges and universities again, not just in terms of race, but also in terms of gender, because men are not going to college in the same way that women are. And that bro culture, universe, maniverse, whatever, the idea that women are getting jobs or women are becoming CEOs or women are having this more cachet and men don't have these degrees is a big part of that too. I mean, it feels so superficial when you think about like you're insecure about this, like, but at the heart of it, that's kind of what it is.
Yeah, you have almost everything and it's not enough. So now we suffer.
Not enough.
Right.
Yeah.
So final question about just sort of what comes next. I mean, obviously a lot of institutions are caving. You know, I think that Columbia is the first one to come after. On the one hand, I understand they were the first one to get this kind of pressure, so I understand that maybe they were the most spooked. I also felt like if you're the first one and you recognize you're at the front line of a battle, you kind of have to think a lot about what stance you're going to take. But there have been universities pushing back. The president of Princeton, I think, has pushed back. My alma mater, Wesleyan, has not been targeted yet, though they may well be soon because
they're working
Michael
for it.
Roth is, has been, and I'm really proud of him. He's really been out there kind of defending all.
Like, put me in, coach.
Yeah, exactly. But obviously, there's like a chilling effect. A lot of universities are in sort of defensive crouch mode. But do you feel like there's at least now multiple paths of how you can react to this kind of pressure presenting themselves for people?
I don't feel that yet. I don't feel that yet. I feel like a lot of colleges and universities are being more reactionary and less strategic, especially Columbia. Just sure, fine, okay, whatever you want. Like, and not really thinking about how this will play out down the road, how this will fundamentally change the identity and culture of a university. And I think about that a lot in my own institution, just like what concessions change the fabric and identity of Wellesley being Wellesley. And I don't have great answers for that. I don't think anyone really has great answers, but people are trying to figure it out and trying to figure out what they can leverage and what they can push back on and what they're going to concede. And I think that's what's really terrifying to me is the concessions of it all. Who is going to be the most harmed by this? It might take another generation or two before they get traction again.
Yeah, I agree that it looks pretty bleak. There are a lot of different ways people are pushing back. And actually, one of the best things for the pushback has been Columbia. Columbia has given the Trump administration everything they wanted and more. And every time they do, the Trump administration is like, more. Yeah, now they're basically, they have a consent decree that they're putting against Columbia. It's a very like give a mouse a cookie moment, which is just a softer way of like give Hitler Czechoslovakia moment. Right. And what it's shown is that you can't actually appease them. If you give them what they want, they're going to punch you in the face one more time. So you now you get to see what all of the other options are and what else might work, because the administration has shown doing what they say doesn't save you.
Nope.
And so we'll see through the lawsuits and through things like Princeton, Wesleyan speaking out, if they're able to actually protect themselves that way. I think they're all going to be damaged in some way. The question is how irreparably. But at least Columbia has shown there's no point in going down without a fight.
Yeah, there really isn't.
All right. Well, no surprise with this topic. We went quite long today, but this was really great. I mean, I don't know. I find this history really grounding and important to kind of understand this relationship and the way people have navigated moments like this, even as rocky as this one is in the past. So I really appreciate it. I hope everyone has a great Sunday. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And thanks to everyone who's watching on YouTube, and subscribe to the newsletter and help us put this all together by giving us questions and more. We will continue to do context-filled conversations on Sundays, and we will be back with a regular old episode on Tuesday. See you soon.